Amara was a black waitress at Sonny's Diner, and she had no idea that on one fateful day, she would make a decision that no one could have prepared her for. She was about to stand up for someone who had earned respect in the world, but to many in her small community, it seemed controversial. That decision would change her life forever. The evening shift at Sonny's Diner was always predictable. It was the kind of place where every seat was filled with regulars who had their favorite corner, their favorite coffee, and their usual orders memorized by Amara. A 29-year-old with a warm smile and a natural gift for making people feel seen, Amara had worked at Sonny's for 3 years. The small diner, tucked in the quiet park of Berkeley in San Francisco, felt like home, not just for her, but for the older locals who sought refuge there. They'd sit with their coffee and pie, reminiscing about days gone by, often watching their beloved Golden State Warriors games on the TV. But tonight, everything would change. The bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer, and Amara barely glanced up, expecting another regular. But as her eyes landed on the figure entering the diner, her breath caught in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was none other than Steph Curry, the Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors. For a moment, she froze. The star of the Warriors, one of the most celebrated athletes in the world, had just walked into her diner. Even though he was dressed casually, wearing a hoodie and sneakers, his aura filled the room. The older patrons at the counter turned, their whispers rising. Amara's heart pounded, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. She'd seen Curry perform countless times on the basketball court, but never did she imagine he'd walk into her quiet little diner. Gathering her composure, she approached his table with the kind of friendly demeanor she had perfected over the years. "Good evening. What can I get for you tonight?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the butterflies in her stomach. Steph smiled at her, his kindness disarming her instantly. "Just a coffee black, and maybe a slice of whatever pie you've got," he said. "Coming right up," Amara replied, her voice calm, even though her pulse was racing. As she made her way to the counter, Amara could sense the shift in the room. The regulars were whispering, exchanging glances. Some were smiling, clearly excited by his presence. Others were still trying to confirm it was really him. She returned with his coffee and a slice of pie, trying her best to act normal. "Here you go, enjoy," she said, setting the items in front of him. "Thanks," he replied with another warm smile, before turning his gaze out the window. Amara couldn't help but watch him for a moment. Despite his fame, he seemed so unassuming, lost in thought, perhaps even a little tired. But not everyone shared her admiration. Earl, one of the diner's older regulars, wasn't thrilled to see Curry. Earl was a staunch supporter of the Sacramento Kings, the Warriors' biggest rival. He was known for his bluntness and his sometimes overly critical opinions. As Earl stood up and walked toward Curry's table, Amara felt her stomach tighten. "Excuse me," Earl began, his voice cutting through the quiet buzz of the diner. "Aren't you that basketball guy, Steph Curry?" Curry looked up and smiled politely. "Yes, that's me." Earl crossed his arms, a skeptical frown on his face. "I've been reading about you," he said, his tone suddenly accusatory. "You make millions, but what do you actually do for folks who need it? Heard you're pretty stingy with all that cash." Amara, who had been clearing plates at the next table, froze. She glanced at Curry, who remained calm and collected. "I try to give back where I can," Curry replied evenly. "I've supported education programs, built basketball courts for kids, and helped fund charities." Earl scoffed. "Sounds like a PR stunt to me. You big shots only care about your image." The murmurs around the diner grew louder. Some of the customers nodded, others exchanged skeptical glances. Amara felt her anger rise. Earl's words were not just unfair, they were deeply misinformed. She couldn't stand by and let someone she admired be berated like this. Summoning all her courage, she stepped forward. "Earl," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "That's not true. Steph Curry has done more than most people could dream of. He's given scholarships to students who couldn't afford college, donated to disaster relief efforts, and supported mental health programs." The room fell silent. Every eye was on her. Earl's frown deepened. "And you believe all that?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. How do you know he's not just doing it for the headlines? Because actions speak louder than word, Amara countered, her voice gaining strength. I've read about the kids whose lives have changed because of his foundation. He doesn't have to do any of that, but he does because he cares. Curry looked at her, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. We live in a world where people with the means don't always step up, Amara continued, her voice growing more confident. But when someone like Steph does, it's not fair to tear them down. The diner buzzed with whispers. Some patrons looked moved by her defense, while others remained skeptical. Earl huffed and muttered under his breath, returning to his seat. But Amara wasn't done. Not yet. As the tension hung in the air, Mr. Sullivan, the diner's owner, stepped out from the kitchen. His face was dark, his expression hard. Amara, he said sharply, motioning for her to come over. What were you thinking? Amara approached, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming. You don't argue with customers, especially not regulars like Earl, Mr. Sullivan scolded. I wasn't arguing, Amara replied, her voice trembling. I was standing up for someone who didn't deserve to be treated that way. Mr. Sullivan shook his head. This is a business, not a debate club. Earl and the other regulars are the backbone of this place. If they're upset, we lose their loyalty. I can't have that. I think it's best if you find another job. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. You're firing me for defending someone? Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Sullivan nodded. I'll give you a few days to transition. Amara's vision blurred as tears welled up, but she held her head high. She glanced at Curry, who had risen from his seat and was watching the exchange. He looked regretful, but there was no time for that now. I'm sorry, Curry said quietly as she passed by, gathering her things. Thank you for standing up for me. You didn't have to do that, but it meant a lot. Amara nodded, managing a weak smile. You're welcome. With that, she gathered her things and left the diner, unsure of what the future held. The morning after losing her job at Sonny's Diner, Amara felt a heaviness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Her usual enthusiasm for the day had evaporated, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of loss. Sonny's had been more than just a place to work. It had been a part of her life for the past 3 years. It was where she'd built relationships, gotten to know the regulars, and found comfort in the predictable rhythm of serving coffee, pie, and familiar faces. Now it felt like everything had been torn from her in an instant. The sting of last night's events was still fresh. Fired for standing up for someone she admired, for doing what was right. It didn't make sense. She had expected to be supported, even praised for her courage. But instead, Mr. Sullivan had shown her the door. Worse, the regulars, people she had served with a genuine smile for so long, had stood silent, indifferent, as Earl's harsh words went unchallenged. Amara sat at the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall. The silence in the apartment felt suffocating. She'd never expected that standing up for someone like Steph Curry, someone who had always inspired her, would cost her everything. The humiliation from Mr. Sullivan's words echoed in her mind, along with the judgment from the regulars. It wasn't just the loss of her job. It was the feeling of being abandoned, even by those she'd considered friends. But as she sat there, the reality of the situation started to settle in. She wasn't without options. She had her skills, her work ethic, and her ability to connect with people. Maybe the diner wasn't the only place where she could make a difference. Maybe it wasn't the end of her story, just a painful chapter. Amara took a deep breath, her gaze turning to the window. The morning light streamed in, casting a warm glow on the city outside. San Francisco, with all its promise and opportunity, seemed distant now, but she wasn't ready to give up. She would have to keep moving forward, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The bills were due, rent was coming up, and she needed a way to support herself until she figured things out. Reluctantly, she put on her coat and headed out. Her heart felt heavy, but she knew she couldn't sit in despair. She needed to get her final paycheck from Mr. Sullivan. It was the last piece of Sonny's she would ever hold. And although it felt like a bitter reminder of everything that had happened, she couldn't avoid it. The walk to the diner was short, but every step felt like it weighed a ton. The crisp morning air did little to ease the tightness in her chest. As she neared the diner, she saw something that made her pause. A sleek, black SUV was parked outside, its polished exterior gleaming in the early light. It was completely out of place against the backdrop of Sonny's modest, slightly worn facade. Amara stood frozen for a moment, confusion creeping in. What was this all about? With a deep breath, she pushed open the door, the familiar bell jingling as she entered. But today there was no familiar hum of chatter or friendly greetings. Instead, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Amara's eyes scanned the room, her heart skipping a beat when they landed on the figure seated in one of the booths. It was Steph Curry. He sat casually, his posture relaxed, but the energy in the room shifted as soon as he entered. Mr. Sullivan, standing behind the counter, looked frozen, his face a mixture of confusion and anxiety. The regulars, who had once been her audience, were now strangely subdued, their eyes darting between Steph and Amara. The tension was palpable. Steph stood as she entered, his warm smile a stark contrast to the uneasy atmosphere in the diner. "Amara," he called out gently, "can we talk?" Amara's heart raced. She nodded, still stunned by the sight of him. The last thing she expected was for him to be here, of all places, especially after what had happened. But there was something in his presence that made her feel seen. She followed him to the booth, feeling the weight of every set of eyes on her. As they sat down across from each other, Steph leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and sincere. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened last night," he began. "You stood up for me when you didn't have to, and I respect that more than I can say." Amara blinked, still unsure of how to respond. "I just thought you deserved someone to stand up for you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You didn't deserve that." Steph smiled, nodding in understanding. "That's exactly why I'm here," he said, his tone steady but filled with admiration. "What you did took courage. It showed me the kind of person you are. Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's rare, and it's something I deeply admire." Amara was silent for a moment, processing his words. This was the last thing she expected when she woke up that morning. She had lost her job, and yet here she was, sitting across from one of the most famous athletes in the world, receiving praise for her actions. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you here?" Steph's smile softened and he leaned in slightly. "Because I want you to be part of something bigger. My foundation is expanding. We're launching new programs to support underprivileged kids, improve access to education, and create opportunities for people who need a second chance. And we need people like you, people who care, people who are passionate about making a difference." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Completely," Steph said without hesitation. "I want you to join the team. It's not waiting tables, but it's a chance to be part of something that truly matters, to use your voice and your heart to help others." For a moment, Amara sat in stunned silence. The weight of his words was overwhelming. She had just lost her job, but here was an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. It was a chance to make a real impact, to use her skills for something meaningful. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Steph grinned, his eyes sparkling. "Say yes," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. Amara nodded, a wide, tearful smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with newfound hope. "Absolutely. Yes." As she shook his hand, sealing the deal, she glanced around the diner. The regulars who had once judged her were now silent, their expressions a mix of disbelief and reluctant respect. Mr. Sullivan stood behind the counter, his face a picture of guilt and confusion. But Amara didn't dwell on it. Her focus was on the future, on the chance to be a part of something bigger than herself. As Steph rose to leave, he turned back to her with a final, encouraging smile. "I'll have someone from my team reach out to you today to get things started. Thank you again for what you did. It meant more than you know." The bell above the door jingled as he walked out, and Amara sat for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She had come in expecting to face another painful reality, but instead, she had found a new beginning. Mr. Sullivan handed her her final paycheck, his expression still conflicted. "I feel you shouldn't have done what you did last night," he said, his voice low, "but I'm sorry for how I treated you." Amara met his gaze steadily, the weight of the past few hours still heavy on her shoulders. "You taught me a valuable lesson," she replied simply, her voice strong. "Sometimes standing up for what's right is worth more than staying quiet to keep a job." With that, she turned and stepped into the sunlight, her heart light with hope. The future, uncertain as it was, suddenly seemed full of possibilities. The weeks that followed Amara's life-changing encounter with Steph Curry were filled with a mixture of excitement and hard work. As promised, someone from Steph's team reached out to her shortly after their conversation, and Amara soon found herself becoming an integral part of the team at the Curry Foundation. It wasn't long before she was traveling to communities in need, organizing educational programs, and meeting with individuals whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. For the first time in her life, Amara felt that her actions truly mattered. She was no longer just a waitress at a diner. She was part of something bigger, something that had the power to change lives. The work was demanding, but it was also incredibly rewarding. Every day, Amara interacted with kids who were getting scholarships they never dreamed of, teachers who were receiving support to enhance their classrooms, and families who were receiving assistance when they had nowhere else to turn. As Amara poured herself into her new role, she found her confidence growing. The pain of losing her job at Sonny's Diner slowly faded as she realized that her actions had led to something far greater than she could have imagined. The community she had been so worried about leaving behind had only been the beginning of a journey that would open doors to a future filled with purpose. And yet, despite the excitement of this new chapter, Amara never forgot what had happened that night in the diner. She often thought about how one simple, courageous act of standing up for what was right had changed the entire trajectory of her life. The pain of losing her job still stung from time to time, especially when she passed by the old diner on her way to work. But she knew deep down that it had been a necessary sacrifice. What had seemed like the end of one chapter had actually been the beginning of a new one filled with meaning, passion, and a chance to make a difference in the world. The lesson in Amara's story is a reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, can lead to unexpected opportunities. It shows that doing the right thing is not always easy, and sometimes it comes with a price, but the rewards are worth it. In a world where people often stay silent to avoid conflict or protect their own interests, Amara's bravery stood out as a beacon of integrity. The story also highlights the importance of having the courage to speak up for others, even when they may not be able to defend themselves. In a moment where Steph Curry was unfairly attacked by Earl, Amara's defense wasn't just about protecting the famous athlete. It was about standing up for truth and justice. She didn't let the fear of what others might think hold her back. Furthermore, Amara's journey teaches us that sometimes the path we fear walking, the one that involves loss and sacrifice, can lead us to something far greater than we ever imagined. While she thought losing her job at Sonny's Diner was a setback, it turned out to be the stepping stone to a life of fulfillment and purpose, where her actions had a profound impact on others. Ultimately, Amara's story is about finding the strength to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. It's about using our voice and our actions to make the world a better place, even in the face of adversity. And most importantly, it's a reminder that doing the right thing is never wasted. It often opens the door to a new beginning, one that brings us closer to the person we are meant to become. As Amara sat back at her desk, her thoughts drifting toward the many children she had met through the foundation, she smiled. She had found her purpose, and it was everything she had hoped for and more. And though her journey was just beginning, she knew that no matter what lay ahead, she would continue to stand up for what was right, knowing that sometimes that's all it takes to change a life, starting with your own.